Great. So I guess it's appropriate, me coming from spending most of my time in institutional licensing in a general scientific society to provide you a general overview of what it means to pivot towards non-academic markets when you're coming from a publisher who primarily operates in academic markets. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think a lot of the touch points that we have from an academic publisher's perspective are with academia. If you think of where most of our content is published in our journals, it comes from academia, and that's what the share of the market stipulates. So Tricia and Pat will give you more of the specific use cases that they've seen, but here, let me grab this slide. Thanks. Hopefully this works. It does. All right, so agenda. So what are we going to cover today in my presentation? I'm going to define what I mean by non-academic markets. I'm going to go over the assumptions of the publishers that I've worked at previously. Safe harbor, I'm not talking about annual reviews. I've only been there for a couple weeks. Important points of differentiation between market segments. Leveraging the 4 Ps. My marketing folks, do you guys know what the 4 Ps are? Okay, great. Pipeline and customer lifecycle considerations, and then finally some food for thought and conclusion at the end. So what do I mean by non-academic markets? So essentially what I mean is that any institution that doesn't grant degrees but consumes scholarly content as a critical function of their organization. So these the major market segments I'll be covering are research institutes, including government, so NIH, Max Planck, etc. Hospitals, excluding teaching research, and I exclude those because in my prior past experience, I've worked with enterprise-wide site licenses, so affiliated hospitals tend to be covered by our licenses, so we always lump those two up together. Government agencies, excluding research institutes, and the major distinction here is that they don't have large contingencies or high concentrations of researchers. And then finally, corporates. So at all the publishers that I've worked at, the assumptions that I think as an organization as a whole, when we look at the institutional licensing market, are 3 things. We sell exclusively to librarians. Our products live exclusively in libraries, and our non-academic pricing should be a function of academic pricing. And keep these things in mind as I go through the presentation here, because they have a great impact on our approach to the market and how we develop our products. So, points of differentiation. In general, academic institutions always utilize librarians. They're managing highly sophisticated electronic resource management systems that include discovery layers. This happens all within the context of a library, and whether it's physical or digital, or whether they actually have a library or not. And they typically have large numbers of relevant FTEs. So I bring that point up because the last assumption, non-academic pricing is a function of academic pricing. This greatly impacts the value proposition when you approach non-academic markets and you think about non-academic markets within the context of academic pricing, which most journals, most publications now have some type of tiering model that has a sizing component, whether it be FTE or the very disliked site model. So that's something you want to consider. But as we move from left to right here, you can see that the value proposition for research institutes is highly aligned with academic, and as we go further down the line, we get further and further away, so our assumptions become less and less effective when we approach these markets. As a result, the market penetration in general, the societies that I've worked for, the publishers that I've worked for, has been seen like this. So the highest saturation has been academic institutions, and then following. The number 4 and number 3, government and hospitals, is flipped, and that's primarily a function of content. Hospitals are not likely to purchase your content, non-teaching research hospitals, if it's not clinical in nature. So there's special considerations you're going to have to go, and this may impact, for example, if you have content that's more clinically focusing, it may perform differently than your more basic science research content. So how do we close the gaps, so to speak, when we look at this? Who here is familiar with the sales funnel? Okay, so the sales funnel is a way to kind of quantify and visualize your marketing and sales functionality. So as we move from the different levels, from prospects to leads to customers, these are essentially conversion points. If you're awesome, it won't look like a triangle, right? It'll look like a square, but most people aren't awesome, so it looks like this. So that said, if you think about theoretically speaking, if I can get a larger pool of relevant prospects, those percentages of conversion points should equate to higher numbers of leads and higher numbers of customers. So currently, with our assumptions of the market, this is primarily how we're functioning, right? We're fishing for prospects with a fishing rod. We're catching few and far between because few and far between are relevant to our assumptions of how we place our product in the marketplace. So how do we transition from fly fishing to trawling? So I think our assumptions should drive development and approach. And if we think about it within the context of the 4 Ps, so product, price, promotion, and place. So, from a product perspective, think about it. If we're selling to librarians, we talk about things like counter usage reports, counter compliance, impact factor, access control. We talk about easy proxy. So those are the things. Those are the main drivers, and also discovery. Right? Discovery is a big thing. How do end users get to our content? Right? And libraries and librarians invest a lot of money into discovery systems. Well, when you think about your one-off biotech, they don't have a librarian that's facilitating a highly sophisticated discovery system. So again, you're injuring yourself you're starting at a disadvantage from the perspective of not giving them the tools in order to drive up usage and increase that value proposition. And that becomes more and more the case if you think about from an FTE perspective, where you have a large organization that has a high number of FTE but a low number of researchers, and you try to sell them on a pricing model that looks at it from that perspective, they're not going to see the value there, primarily because they're not going to see the usage. Price, again, kind of touching on that. Promotion is how you reach out to them. So email marketing, social media, and actually in the case of corporate markets, because you're not dealing with librarians, social media may be a more effective way to reach out to relevant researchers. So I think when I sit with marketing folks and we're kind of dismissive of them reaching out to social media channels because we're thinking within the context of reaching out to librarians. Librarians aren't looking for the next journal they want to buy on Twitter. They're looking for it within catalogs, they're looking at it at conferences. So this actually might be a place where you can reach out to a broader audience. And then finally, places where you engage with your customer. And that also has a major impact here, primarily because the access to contact information in non-academic circles is not as easily accessible. So where we kind of, and I'll touch on this a little bit later actually, so hold my thought there. I'll hold my thought there. So changing your approach, leveraging the 4 Ps. So this is just kind of give you an idea of how much of an impact, if you are at a publisher that holds those assumptions, how much of an impact as you try to pivot towards these various market segments, it'll have on your current approach. So research institutes, if you don't already, you should have a high saturation there, primarily because they're more in line with your assumptions. Hospitals, less so the case. Again, it's highly subject to your content area, so you may or may not have successes there. Government, less so the case. Again, this is non-research institutes, so a lower value proposition there based on your current assumptions. And then corporate, unless you have a corporate specific model and you've completely removed yourself from the assumptions of the marketplace, you're going to have a lot of work to do there. And so one thing you have to consider when you're trying to approach the corporate market is the amount of time and effort that you're going to have to differentiate yourself from, or differentiate your product and the way that you promote it and pricing, et cetera, because that's going to take time and resources. So you really have to do a good deal of sizing the market and ensuring that whatever money that you spend, whatever time and resource you invest, that you're going to see the return. So that's where, terms like cost of acquisition are important to consider. So what impacts does it have on the pipeline? So this is the leads portion of it, right? So in the academic market, we're spoiled from a salesperson's perspective. When we're talking about institutional licensing sales, we're talking about multi-stakeholder sales. So we're talking, I can go to any library website, I can identify key faculty members, I can identify acquisitions librarians, I can identify subject librarians, I can identify collection librarians. So I can go to any website, and also for the most part, because a lot of these guys use the same platforms, I can always find where it is, right? You don't have this in the corporate space. You don't have this in the hospital space. You may and you may not, but it's much more diffuse when you go out there and you look at this and try to gather from a salesperson's perspective, try to gather that relevant information that you need to qualify a prospect, to develop a proposal. And there's other considerations here as well. So in terms of negotiations, you have to have a different licensing model. You have to remember that these guys are using your content, especially from the corporate perspective, for the purposes of commercializing, for commercial purposes. So you have to ensure that there's special terminology in there that stipulates that they can use that content in that manner, right? And there's probably also additional pricing considerations in there as well. A lot of publishers now, now that we're talking about TDM, text and data mining, will have special contingencies in there for corporate text and data mining. That's an opportunity for publishers, and it's highly tied to the value that they bring. And also, one special consideration there when you're talking about licensing is reminding the corporate customer, especially if you have perpetual access policies, that their investment in our resources is not part of their operating costs. It really is a capital expenditure because they get to retain whatever they purchase. So you turn something from a cost to an investment. That's something that resonates pretty well with corporates. And then other considerations, again, because these aren't happening within the context of a library, onboarding becomes especially important, making sure that the access control methods are set up correctly, and et cetera. So obviously, my experience has been in subscription sales. So every year, we get to sell to our customer over and over again. So in terms of the customer life cycle, special considerations here. Onboarding, again, is highly important. These aren't librarians. They're not constantly checking that their IPs, they're not constantly checking with their IT teams that their IPs are up to date. So you have to follow up with them on those types of things. Nurturing, extremely important. Every year, librarians tend not to cut resources or look at ROI in the same manner that corporate would, right? They'll look at cutting resources when they need to cut resources, and they will look at ROI, but for the most part, these guys are on autopilot, not so much the case when it comes to corporate. That being said, renewal follow-up needs to happen earlier. Give yourself and the customer time to reestablish that value proposition, reintroduce them to the product, because at the time when they're spending the money, they have to justify the investment. And negotiations are special considerations there. Mergers and acquisition are consistently happening in the corporate sphere. So you have to be prepared with pricing model considerations there that are clear, that you can clearly communicate and establish a clear value proposition for that customer, especially when you're talking about two existing customers coming together. How do you price them, and a new and existing customer coming together? How do you price that? So food for thought. So those of you who attended the keynote, it sounds like the academic sphere is going to be less and less a place that can support our investment in material resources for journals. So just to give you an idea of where our potential consumers are, in a 2014 report by the American Institutes for Research, 61% of STEM PhD holders were in non-academic positions. The private sector was the largest employer, followed by the government sector. 57% of those are working in R&D. So if you kind of play with the percentages, it almost is the same exact percentage of R&D workers in private and government as there are in academia. According to a 2015 report by the OECD, tax incentives supporting business R&D equated to $50 billion in 28 OECD countries. So that's a good amount of money that they're investing in R&D. 60% of R&D in scientific and technical fields is carried out by corporations, 20 and 10% by academia and government. So, and then finally, around 460,000 records in identified database in Ringgold, 26% of those are academic, and then 24% of those are corporate. So if we think back to our market saturations, at least from my experience, the number 1 was academic, and the number 5, the lowest, was corporate. So there's a large gap there, right? So that means opportunity, but it's just a matter of how we play with the 4 Ps in approaching that market and whether or not your content is relevant enough to reach those markets. So, conclusion. We need to develop new assumptions for the various market segments. Think about the 4 Ps within the context of each market segment and when determining your end, that will drive your approach. Prepare for subtle differences in the sales pipeline and customer lifecycle. And then finally, the most important, buy a big bag to put the money in. So.